She felt it before he even reached for her. That stillness, just a moment too long, the kind of pause that draws attention without trying. He didn't move fast. He didn't need to. His confidence wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, deliberate, practiced. The way his hand rested lightly against her back didn't announce itself. Simply waited. He knew exactly when to apply pressure. Exactly when to let it linger. And in that moment, something in her leaned in. Not her body, but something more subtle. Something internal. It surprised her. What unsettled her wasn't the hug. It was how safe it felt. How strangely intimate the silence between their movements became. It didn't feel like a gesture. Felt like a message. But it wasn't a message she could translate. That was part of its power. He let go at the exact moment her body began to relax into his. Not too soon, not too late. And when he stepped back, he didn't look away. He watched her. Not with need. Not even with interest. With a calm certainty that suggested he'd already seen what he needed to see. She smiled reflexively, trying to keep the balance. But the balance had already shifted. She would replay that hug for days, wondering what it meant. Not because anything extraordinary happened, but because something had changed in her response. It wasn't about the physicality. It was the precision. The restraint. He didn't use charm the way others did. He used silence. And silence has weight when it's intentional. People like him don't seduce with words. They seduce with absence. With a presence so measured, so carefully controlled, it forces the other person to lean forward. She didn't know it then, but that lean was the beginning of the entanglement. He wasn't trying to get close. He was drawing her in. And there's a difference. She noticed how effortless he made it seem. How his timing always placed him just far enough away to seem uninterested, but just close enough to remain unforgettable. That tension created a pull. She found herself thinking about him without reason, scanning her phone, waiting for signs. He never gave her what she expected, but he never fully disappeared either. That inconsistency became the hook. The mind tries to make sense of what the body can't explain. Her thoughts became crowded with justification. Maybe he was cautious. Maybe he had been hurt. Maybe she was different and he didn't know how to handle that. The story kept adjusting to protect her from the more painful realization that he wasn't offering connection. He was offering a performance designed to trigger her longing. He didn't rush intimacy. He suggested it. He moved through conversations like he was gently testing for weak points. Not to exploit them, but to keep control of the environment. He mirrored vulnerability without exposing anything real. She couldn't tell if she felt safe or disoriented. Both somehow. The brilliance of someone like him lies in their restraint. They don't flood you with attention. They give just enough to activate your hope. The hug wasn't accidental. It was choreography. It wasn't affection. It was calibration. She started to anticipate his presence. Her focus narrowed. She noticed how often she filtered her expression around him. How often she waited for him to initiate something. Anything. Her internal world began to revolve around what might come next. And in doing so, she lost touch with her own center. That's how it works. The attention is inconsistent, but the impact is precise. It bypasses logic and goes straight to the nervous system. The highs feel earned. The lows feel like your fault. And in that gap, the attachment takes hold. She wouldn't have called it attachment at first. She would have said it felt exciting, maybe rare. There was a quiet dignity to how he carried himself. A self-possession that looked like depth. But what she didn't realize was that it wasn't depth. It was control. And control always leaves a residue. A kind of disorientation you can't quite name. He didn't need to manipulate her. She was already doing the work for him. Interpreting his pauses. Filling in his silences. Projecting meaning onto his absence. That projection is powerful. It allows us to stay engaged with people who offer very little, because what they offer isn't substance, it's potential. And potential can feel more compelling than reality when your emotional history is full of unmet needs. She began to feel herself shift. Not dramatically. Slowly, she noticed how often she was waiting, for a text, for a signal, for something that confirmed she was still in his orbit. The uncertainty consumed more space in her mind than she wanted to admit. This wasn't love. This was anxiety misinterpreted as intensity. And it wasn't new. She'd been here before, though the faces had changed. The pattern hadn't. There was always someone just out of reach. Someone who didn't ask for her heart but accepted it freely. Someone who gave less than they received, yet made her feel like she was the one who needed to earn more. He didn't lie to her. That's part of why it was so hard to walk away. There were no promises to hold him accountable to. He didn't say he loved her. He didn't even say he needed her. But he looked at her in a way that suggested he understood her. That suggestion was enough. When you've gone too long without feeling seen, even simulated intimacy feels real. It wasn't just about him. It was about the part of her that kept mistaking complexity for connection. She had internalized the belief that love was something to unlock. That if she could just show up the right way, hold the right posture, ask the right questions, he'd finally let her in. But the door she was knocking on didn't lead anywhere. It was a wall dressed as a doorway. And he never pretended otherwise. That's the trap. The ambiguity doesn't live in his words. It lives in the gap between his actions and her interpretations. That's where attachment grows. In the absence of clarity, hope expands. Hope isn't always a virtue. Sometimes it's a defense. A refusal to accept what's in front of us because we're too emotionally invested in what we want it to become. She started to see that, in flashes. In the way her stomach tightened before seeing him. In the way her questions never got answered directly. In the way she'd shrink when his mood shifted. She began to track how much of herself she was losing to keep the idea of him alive. But even that realization didn't bring relief. It brought grief. Because it meant accepting that the story she was building wasn't shared. That she wasn't discovering something rare. She was reenacting something old. People like him don't need to be cruel to be harmful. They just need to be consistent in their inconsistency. Their allure isn't in what they give. It's in what they withhold. And what we believe their approval might mean about us if we ever truly earned it. The hug stayed with her not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. The moment she believed she had been chosen. The moment she allowed herself to imagine something deeper, something safe, something finally real. That belief wasn't wrong. It was just misplaced. He didn't want her heart. He wanted her attention. And attention, when given freely, becomes a form of power. That was the hardest truth to face. Not that he deceived her, but that she was willing to deceive herself. That her need to be seen overpowered her ability to discern. That she had placed her longing into someone who had no intention of holding it. And now, without apology or anger, she begins to step back. Not because she stopped caring, but because she started noticing how much she was disappearing in the space he created. What started as a touch became a mirror. And she's finally ready to look into it. There was no dramatic conclusion. No final betrayal. No moment she could point to as proof of who he was beneath the surface. That's what made it harder to leave. There was nothing to accuse him of. He hadn't lied. He hadn't promised. But somehow he had still taken something. He took her attention, her stillness, her certainty. And she gave it freely, believing she was making an investment in something meaningful. But the return never came. What she received in exchange was a pattern, one that felt familiar in ways she had never wanted to admit. The silent waiting, the second-guessing, the way her sense of worth rose and fell in reaction to his presence. This wasn't new. It had just been better disguised. She had outgrown the obvious versions of this dynamic, the ones where she knew she was being undervalued but stayed anyway, hoping it might shift. This one was more sophisticated. It looked calm, measured, respectful even. There was no volatility, no chaos. Just a quiet erosion of her inner equilibrium. A gradual disconnection from herself, masked as anticipation for someone else. She started to notice how much of her inner dialogue was no longer her own. It had become a loop of imagined conversations, silent rehearsals, endless interpretation of subtle signals. He barely had to speak. Her mind was doing all the work. That was the trap. Not what he gave, but what he allowed her to give away without resistance. What he was offering wasn't partnership. It was a stage. A place for her hopes and projections to perform until she realized she was the only one in the room. That realization wasn't empowering. Not at first. It was hollow. Embarrassing even. Because it forced her to confront the part of herself that still believed she could earn love by being patient, by being understanding, by being everything except honest about what she needed. She had told herself that he was private, that he moved slowly, that he was being careful. But the truth was simpler. He was keeping her at a distance because he needed control. And closeness threatened that. Closeness required response. Not performance. Not charisma. But presence. And presence exposes people. He couldn't risk being seen in that way. So he stayed just far enough to remain undefined. Close enough to feel important but distant enough to stay safe. He never denied her. He never claimed her. He lived in the space between the two, where the rules are unclear and accountability disappears. And in that space, she lost track of what she was actually waiting for. The moment she stopped trying to make sense of him, the clarity started to return. He wasn't emotionally unavailable. He was emotionally avoidant. And the difference mattered. Because one implies limitation, the other suggests intent. He knew how to connect when it served him. He just chose not to. That wasn't her responsibility to solve. She had made excuses for him out of compassion. But compassion without boundaries becomes a slow betrayal of the self. She wasn't being patient. She was being pulled into a pattern that fed on her silence. She thought she could handle it, that she was evolved enough, aware enough to navigate it without being harmed. But awareness without self-honesty is a performance. And what she needed wasn't another opportunity to prove her resilience. What she needed was the courage to name what was happening before it fully hollowed her out. He wasn't a monster. He was just practiced. And being practiced is dangerous because it means he knows what works. It means he's learned how to offer just enough emotional resonance to keep people close, without ever surrendering control. He knew how to touch, but not how to stay, and she had been touched enough. She didn't need more subtle glances or restrained affection. She didn't need another moment that felt profound but ended in silence. What she needed was contact that led somewhere. Connection that had shape, and weight, and continuity. She thought about confronting him, not with anger but with honesty. Not to change him but to free herself. But she knew how he'd respond. He would listen calmly, nod at the right moments, apologize without accountability. He would mirror back just enough sincerity to avoid the weight of the truth. And she would leave feeling heard but not met. Again. So she chose not to explain. She chose to leave without permission. There was no revenge in it. No performance. Just a quiet refusal to participate in her own disorientation any longer. As she withdrew, the discomfort grew louder. Because it wasn't just about walking away from him. It was about walking away from the self who kept choosing people like him. The version of her who believed attention could substitute for care. Who thought depth could be proven through confusion. Who saw restraint and imagined integrity, when it was really fear. She grieved that version of herself. Not because she was weak, but because she had tried so hard to be enough for someone who never showed up with the same intention. Healing didn't look like deleting his number or blocking his profile. It looked like tracing back the origins of her hunger. It meant asking harder questions about why distance felt like desire. Why emotional unavailability had become a kind of challenge she wanted to overcome. She remembered the first time she felt unseen by someone she loved. How long it took for her to accept that she couldn't make them stay present. That realization had left a mark. Not a scar exactly. More like a lens. One that distorted her perception of closeness for years. He had fit perfectly into that lens. Not because he was meant for her. But because he activated something she still hadn't resolved. He gave her the illusion of being chosen without ever choosing her. And she had accepted it because it felt familiar. Familiarity isn't love. It's just what we've learned to expect. The work now wasn't about understanding him. It was about rebuilding her relationship with expectation. It was about recognizing the difference between connection and activation. Between being seen and being used as a projection screen. She no longer wanted to be the woman who turned emotional starvation into a kind of romance. Who called confusion complexity. Who waited for attention like it was proof of something sacred. She wanted a quieter love. One that didn't require translation. One that didn't begin with disorientation and end with self-doubt. She wanted to feel safe enough to be honest from the start, not slowly unravel her needs and hope the other person didn't flinch. It would take time to find that. Time to recondition her nervous system. Time to trust her instincts again. But she was willing. Because she remembered what it felt like to belong to herself before she started bending to be chosen. The next time someone hugs her, she'll still feel it. The warmth. The closeness. The weight of presence. But she'll be watching something else now. Not their technique. Not their composure. She'll be watching for consistency. For self-awareness. For emotional capacity. Because seduction lives in moments. But real connection lives in patterns. And she's not chasing moments anymore. If you felt yourself in this story, not just in the surface emotions, but in the places it hurt to recognize, stay with that feeling. Like this video to anchor the moment. Share it with someone who keeps meeting the same pattern and calling it love. And subscribe to this channel if you're ready for voiceovers that don't just entertain. They wake you up. New stories each week, built for healing, not performance.